I'm Phyllis Messenger, the Grants Coordinator for the Institute for Advanced Study, and our offices are here in this building. So it's great to have you all here in our home. We have four panelists. One of them, Chandy's not here yet, but we're going to get started because we have so much information, and I know you have probably lots of questions and comments that you want to include as well. So our first presenter will be Anna Brailovsky. She's the grants consultant in CLA, and so she oversees grant seeking in the social sciences and has a background in economics and art history. And she's going to talk about where to look for funding and some of the issues that arise in putting together funding for international projects. So, Anna.
Where is my presentation here?
So it's in a folder.
In here?
That should be it.
Okay.
There we go.
Excellent. Do you know how to make this, Phyllis? Or do you know how do I make that? Okay. So I have just put that up there for your general consideration while I speak a little bit. So first of all, I just wanted to say a little bit more about my background, and that is that before I came here, I had about 15 years of editorial and translation experience. So I come at this business of research development mainly from the point of view of how to do good persuasive writing and how to translate between the needs of the funder and the needs of the researcher, which is really one of the primary reasons why grants don't get funded, is that people really don't understand that there are differences between those two things. But since I only have about 10 minutes, I'm not going to make this really about grantsmanship or grant writing, but we'll just go through some places where you might be able to look for that sort of information, and then just my experience over the last 3 years here has been, as Phyllis has mentioned, I'm in the social sciences. So the sorts of grants that we do, mainly NSF things, and in terms of international collaboration, there are a lot of ways that people have done this, not specifically looking for international collaborative grants, but just applying through normal, regular NSF programs and having collaborators that they already work with and just asking the NSF to fund them through subawards. So that is a pretty straightforward way that when you have projects that aren't necessarily specific to any program that's out there looking for some kind of outcome. So the reason I put that up there is one of the things that I encounter most when people come to me is that they're really overwhelmed. They come with an RFP that's 70 pages long, and they say, can I really do this? You know, I'm going to put so much of my time into this, and I think that this is a big psychological stumbling block. So one thing I like to tell people is to redefine the way that they see what success in grant writing really means for them, so that when they put 6 weeks of work into a grant application and then they don't get the funding, that they don't feel like they've wasted their time or failed. So if you don't try, obviously, you're not going to get funded. There are some benefits that come from writing a grant especially, and I see you're a mixed group, so I'm sorry if most of what I kind of plan to say is probably geared more to beginning investigators. So at the outset, when you aren't all that experienced in the writing of these things, every grant application that you put in, regardless of what the outcome is going to make you a better grant writer. So some of the outcomes for you personally are you have to articulate your goals in a much different way in a grant application than you would in like a research article, for example, or in a dissertation. Another outcome is, especially when you're writing with a group, you get a very different set of perspectives on your own research. And I think the greatest benefit, obviously, is that even if you don't get reviews back from the committee, part of the grant writing process, you will actually ask people. Hopefully you will have mentors who will read your grant, so you will get feedback. And feedback is absolutely the most essential way to improve the grant. So now I can show you some places where you can start, where you want to look for the grant writing. Before you actually even reach this stage, I think everybody here is here to talk about international collaboration, so I'm assuming that you're kind of having very big project goals in mind, where you're going to go to other countries and collaborate with a large group of people. But before you get to that stage, obviously you are going to need to have done a lot of legwork previously, and I think Katey is going to be talking a lot about there are smaller things that you can do as you kind of build up your portfolio. And so even at the dissertation stage already, if you're going to do research in a foreign country, you will have developed some relationships, maybe with a mentor at another institution, or perhaps within the community in which you're doing field research. So all of these relationships are going to be useful to you later on. So look for travel grants, seed grants, internal grants, maybe a Fulbright semester abroad, where you may not even necessarily be working on the ultimate project you want to be working on, but you're building those relationships that you can go back to. So where to start? The best place, we have a lot of really good resources. This is the library's grant funding page. And we have several search tools. And my favorite one is Pivot, just because it's the broadest one there is. And it has kind of a really good overview of federal grants, private foundations, local things, university-run things. Also, SciVal funding is a relatively newer one from Elsevier, her favorite company. And Foundation Directory Online is one that does exclusively private foundations. But you'd be surprised at what you can find there. They have thousands and thousands of things that you've possibly never heard of. So start there, and there are really good tutorials. And then for federal funding, also I highly recommend, even before you're looking for anything specific, you can go into Pivot or SciVal or foundation.org, and you can set up an email alert. So you go in, you get a login, and you can learn how to do all this. It's pretty basic just by following these links. And then it will send you every week, whatever you find in your search, you'll get a list of maybe, a couple of hundred things for the keywords that you put in. And you narrow it down, and then you save the search and tell it this is what you're looking for. And every week it will send you some kind of alert that tells you what's going on with all these grants. So essentially you never have to do it again. Once you set up one really good search, it's in there. And this is a really good thing to do at the outset of maybe the year as kind of a habit, and then you don't have to think about it again. This is grants.gov. So here I've pulled up all of the available programs from USAID, obviously of a lot of relevance to people who are doing international research. There's different searches that you can do, and again, this is just a good way to get an overview. Okay. Now, if you need help with this, and I'm sure that it's a really good thing to get assistance with this, there are usually people in your unit that can help you, but if there aren't, then the best place to go is the librarian in your subject area. They're extremely knowledgeable, and they know all about these databases, and they run workshops, and if you call them up, they would be happy to meet with you, and then they can kind of walk you through all the best ways with your keyword searches, how to set up all the different databases. Okay, so now here you are You've set up your collaborators, you've been at it for a couple of years, you have a really good project in mind that you want to do, you found an RFP that seems to match, what do you do now? Now, there's a pretty obvious answer to this that surprisingly few people actually come up with, and that's read the RFP really, really carefully. Really be surprised how many people come to me with a grant and say, I want to do this, and then I say, have you read it? And they say no. One reason why people don't read it is, a lot of them are written really in a very daunting way. There's a lot of information at the top that doesn't seem relevant, or it's all administrative, or it's 70 pages long, or something to that effect. So this is kind of the skill that you need to develop, is how to glance over it and pick out maybe the 2 or 3 pages of an RFP that are going to be the most important. And those pieces obviously are the ones that have to do with how to structure your narrative, what are the outcomes that they're looking for, what are the qualifications that you need. That should be absolutely the first thing that you should look for. Look for the section that says eligibility, because a lot of people wind up not realizing that they may not be eligible for a grant until they've actually done some work already toward it. So a lot of people in research are used to working with these standard kind of generic grant mechanisms like the R01 or the discipline-specific NSF grant. And in these cases, there really isn't an agenda that the sponsor has. So the agenda is your own. You know what you want to accomplish, and the purpose of the grant is to convince the review committee that your particular research agenda has intellectual value. When you're working in this area of international collaboration, though, I think there are a lot of other issues that come up, and if you're going to respond to a specific RFP, it's really no longer just about your research agenda. So your research agenda may have led you to this question, but when you're approaching a funder who has issued a specific solicitation, they may not necessarily be looking for precisely what you're offering, but maybe they're looking for 80% of what you're offering, or maybe even a little piece of it. So that's where reading that RFP is extremely, extremely important. So I can give you a couple of examples with larger international collaborative grants that I've worked on that have been successful, where this issue came up. For example, the NEH Digging into Data grant that was recently awarded to the Classics Department and to the Physics Department at CSE. So this grant, it's in its 3rd iteration. The program has been around for 6 years. It comes out every 2 years. And they are asking specifically for digital technological tools being innovated for the purposes of digital humanities. And this project, which was actually originally a Minnesota Futures project, was already collaborating with a platform called Zooniverse, which is a crowdsourcing scientific project. So they were really, really interested in the technical part of it, and the classics part of it was that they were working with this big trove of papyrus fragments that were found in the desert and belonged to Oxford University. And the RFP called for a lot of different things. It needed to have the digital component, it needed to have a humanities component, and it needed to have an international partnership, which they had because this belonged to Oxford. So here we had a project that was already in existence. The collaboration was there. They didn't actually want to pursue the grant because they didn't believe that they were going to get it. So this is another example of I think, people being kind of overwhelmed by the process. So we sat down together and read the RFP, and when they wrote the original draft, it was really a wonderful technical project. And they set out a really, really good overview of what they were going to do to create this, I can't explain it because I'm not a computer scientist, but they were creating this software that was going to recognize the images that they were trying to identify. And when I read this, I said, okay, this is great, but I'm sure you have a research agenda, right? I mean, these were classic scholars, right? And it's obvious, I think, to me and to them, clearly, as people in the humanities, when you read this, you go, wow, the potential of what kinds of questions this thing is going to answer is just huge. We're going to be able to go through this really big pile of Coptic papyrus fragments, and we're going to have this trove of information that people are going to be able to tap. But the NIH was not interested in potential. They specifically in the RFP wanted research questions from the humanities side. And this is something that the PIs had kind of missed in their original draft. So when I went back to them and said, do you have a research question? Well, they had dozens of research questions. So it was just a matter of picking one that they could articulate really well and concisely within this grant, which they did, and they got the grant. So that's one kind of thing that you look for. So in this case, this is still more of a research-oriented grant, so they're not looking for a specific outcome so much as what is it that you're going to study. But then project-oriented grants are a little different because they do want very measurable outcomes that they want you to evaluate, and they want you to demonstrate how you're going to meet those goals. So another grant that I worked on over the past 3 years that was awarded is the USAID HED Columbia Law School partnership with our Center for Human Rights. And in this case, the RFP was very different from what you normally would get because the USD is a highly structured program, and I know you're going to talk about USAID as well. So in this particular program, they were looking to develop human rights clinics in a particular region of Colombia. And the government agency had actually chosen the partners for the RFP already. So it wasn't even a matter of the researcher having their own partnerships. But obviously, it would help in this case if you already had some kind of relationship. So they chose these 4 law schools in the Medellin region of Colombia. And they intended for the American institution that would be awarded this grant to come into these 4 law schools and partner with them in developing curricula. And one of the things that the RFP really emphasized over and over is sustainability. We're going to give you this $1.5 million for 3 years, and then we're going to leave. So what's going to happen afterwards? So they put together a really good program of curricula development. But again, here, when I read it, I didn't think that there was enough sustainability in it. So we went back and kind of brainstormed what can we do with this money that would provide more long-term results. So one thing that they decided to do is bring somebody in to give them an LLM so that they could go back and kind of, without us putting in any more money, they would be the long-term sustainable development in itself. Sorry? I thought somebody said something. Okay, so those are just some instances of what to look for in an RFP. Just really kind of define for yourself very carefully, is there anything that they really want me to do as part of this project that may not have been something I thought of on my own, or even it is something I'm doing on my own, but maybe I just didn't emphasize it in my writing. So the OVPR has this webpage about proposal development. So when I'm actually leading a workshop about grant writing, that's something that we talk about a lot, is all of these 6 things that are really, really helpful. So you read through the RFP and you just figure out. I think that, I've been in this position too as a researcher when I was doing my own graduate work. You live with your research for such a long time that so many things about it become obvious to you, and you see it from a very unique perspective within the field of the research. When you write a grant narrative, you need to be able to lift yourself up above that and try to look for things in your research that maybe you haven't seen before or haven't seen for a really long time, or things that you've kind of forgotten how not obvious they are to people who don't live with it. So it's almost like talking to a complete stranger about your child. Like you've lived with them for 13 years, you know everything about them, and it's very hard to remember that that stuff is not self-evident and obvious. And this is why outside readers are extremely important. So not only to find a colleague who really knows a lot about your field, who can tell you, no, your methodology is like all wrong over here because they're experts, but rather somebody in a field that's maybe tangentially related. So they still get what you're talking about, but they see it from a different point of view. And those people are really going to be able to pinpoint right away where you're being vague or where you're making assumptions, where they can't quite understand how you came to the conclusion you came to. And on this page, you'll see there are links. There's quite a lot of resources out there. If you just, if you Google grant writing, you're going to get lots and lots of good places where people give you pretty much the same advice: how to read an RFP, how to be clear and articulate, how to talk to people not in a jargony way from within your discipline. These are all like really basic grant writing 101 types of things that are very useful. And I would say, don't just read them once, and don't just read the RFP once. When I'm working with someone closely on a grant, I print out the RFP and I read over it every single time that I go to look at their grant narrative, just to remind myself. Because these are things that you need to like constantly repeat so that they're internalized in you, because they're so unlike the way we normally would think about our own work. It's really a sales pitch to people who may not necessarily care about what you're doing. How am I doing in time, Phyllis? 2 minutes? Okay. All right. So now I'll just briefly go over some of the more nitty-gritty things that go into managing a team of people. So when you write a grant, forget about the fact that your research project is your project. For the 6 weeks or so that it's going to take you to write the grant, your project is the grant, which is a very different kind of project. So you have to have a project management mindset that is going to set really realistic goals and hold people to it, because this is one of the most unpleasant things, I think, for PIs, that they don't like to be seen in this position as, I'm maybe dealing with a more senior colleague overseas, and I'm telling them, you have to send me this thing by tomorrow. That's a very difficult thing to do. If you have in your department somebody to help you with this, which many departments do have some kind of staff professional who deals with pre-award things, try to designate an administrative project manager who can take that off your hands, because that kind of takes the emotionality out of it. Usually I handle that for people, or sometimes when they work with grad students or grad student RAs, we introduce them at the start of the process, and it's also good training for them to do it. So set really, really firm boundaries at the beginning. Say that this is our list of deliverables. Here's the RFP. Here's a bullet point of everything that's going to be required from everybody. And we need it by this date because, and explain our spot process. And as many of you probably know, when you have a grant deadline, we have to actually have it vetted by our internal SPA administration. The deadline is normally 24 hours before your deadline, unless you're dealing with grants.gov where it's 5 days. So if you have a partner institution, whether in the US or abroad, usually we'll be making a subcontract to them, so they have to go through the same process on their end, except they have to be done in time for our SPA deadline. So if they have an internal process that's 5 days as well, some of them are even as long as 2 weeks, they have to come in 2 weeks before our 5-day SPA deadline. So you really need to whip out your calendar and plan all this out and make it really clear to everybody what this is. And especially when dealing with international entities and international individuals, some of the things that may come up are things that you didn't necessarily know would come up, and they could be pretty simple things to fix, but an administrator obviously needs time to fix them. So get all of your collaborators to provide you contacts for their administrators if they have them. Some of them will not have them. So one thing, like this summer, I spent hours and hours and hours Skyping with somebody at the University of Buenos Aires because they are extremely decentralized, and there was no administrative person that could help this poor investigator who knew nothing about administration to get an NSF ID so that he could be a PI on our grant, which turned out to be very complicated because their institution didn't have an ID account. So he wound up, with my help after we tried every other avenue, becoming the actual official officer for the entire University of Buenos Aires for getting people NSF IDs so that he could get his own. And fortunately, at this point, we still had a good 3 weeks left before the deadline. But these are the sorts of things that can come up on the administrative end. And the earlier you start the process and the more aware you are of what sorts of things come up, the better you can deal with it. You do not want to be dealing with how to get a fast lane ID for somebody in Buenos Aires without an SRO 24 hours before the deadline, obviously. Okay, so that was basically it. I have a bunch of other anecdotes like that if anybody wants to hear them, but so my best advice to you is get help on the administrative side. There are a lot of people at the university like me and my colleague Alan over there, and even units that don't have an official grant consultant will have pre-award people who are on the accounting side, or post-award people who will know how to set up the award properly so they can be helpful in the pre-award process. And I did have, actually, here's the slide, sorry. See a list of university grant coordinators. On that link, you'll get an Excel spreadsheet, and it will give you all of the people who work in various different units that do that kind of thing. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. Now you're going to hear from two faculty members who actually read the RFPs and were successful with grants. We'll hear next from Chandy John, who is an MD and director of the Division of Global Pediatrics at the medical school. He's going to talk about practical things he knows about setting up an international grant based on his own experience.
How do I get to my next one? Great. Do I just hit next? Okay, thanks for having me. That was a great initial talk, and my talk is going to be, I think, very different than any of the other talks because it's more of a philosophical talk. So for those of you that want really practical stuff, you can tune out. There's a little bit of practical stuff in it. And I also want to mention that it's from a pretty idiosyncratic point of view, so it's from my point of view. So all of what I tell you, I have seen people accomplish success in international research without these things. This is just the way I think it should be done. So take that for what it's worth. And then the other idiosyncratic part of it is that most of my grants have been through the NIH, and they've all been for global health. So this is sort of health-specific information. So to illustrate just how philosophical it is, I have only one slide. It has a few points on it, but just one slide. So, and this is just sort of starting out from the beginning. So this is thinking about if you were going to start international research, what would you want to do? And my first point, which is so obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway because I've seen a lot of people not do this, is to get on sites and find out what the problems are on site. So I have come across many US researchers who have come to me with a problem and they want to do a study in a site that I'm working in. And my first question is, so do you know if it's a problem in that site? You know, have you been out there? Have you seen it? And they haven't. But they say, we can find a collaborator in that site and then we'll do it. But, you know, is it a problem? Do the people there think it's a problem? You know, is it something that you're going to be able to do on the site? So this, I guess, is really obvious, but it's just very, very important, and unfortunately ignored by more people than I'd like to say. And sorry about my typo on the international. It's not international. I've been working in Kenya and Uganda. In Kenya for 18 years and in Uganda for 13 years. So I really believe in the importance of establishing and nurturing your partner sites and your colleagues at those sites. So one of the best ways to have sustainability in your research is to build up infrastructure capacity and training on site, so that if your grant funding runs out, the people you have worked with are now able to get their own grant funding. Now, in many cases, you're working with people who were able to do that before you came. You just provided a separate set of expertise, but that set of expertise may have helped another group of people move toward gaining funding. And so my goal is always that if I'm working in a place, I would like to continue working there for as long as I'm useful, but if we run out of grant funding or for some reason we can't work there, that over years, the people on site will have developed useful skills from what we've done with them, or have equipment or connections or other things that will help them do research, so that they can do research on their own. That's one obvious important part to nurturing partner sites and colleagues. The other is just that as you do research, if you have a long-term relationship with your colleagues in those sites, they can tell you about things that are important. You can develop new aspects, or if colleagues here come to you with, could this be a problem over there, you can talk to them, and you have a connection with them that's born of a long experience of trust and mutual benefit. And that is key to really moving ahead in a bunch of different areas. And for each of these points, for each of the subsequent points, I'll give some examples to show, how that can work out. Again, this is thinking about long-term partnerships. So if you really want a long-term partnership, you need to get institutional buy-in and support. And so this, I run a division of global pediatrics, so I need support from my department chair, but I also need support from the dean of the medical school, because I need to be sure that this isn't always me fighting for these things, that the department actually sees some value in it, and that the medical school actually sees some value in it. And so I think it's important up front to establish that you have the support you need, so that when that grant runs out and the renewal hasn't come in yet, or when you need that little extra piece of funding for the last thing that will really, seal the data in your study, that when you go to the person that can get you that funding, from the university, that it's a sympathetic ear and not a, well, you do that thing overseas and, we don't really care about that. In addition, I think that in terms of building up infrastructure and capacity, there's no good way of doing that solely through your grants and through training grants. You have to, that's probably the main way you do it, but you have to have some university support as well, or it's just not going to happen, especially it's not going to happen long term. It's okay to start small. So these next 2 points sort of contradict each other, but it's okay to start small. So pilot grants for $5,000, educational grants, things that get you on the ground and help you see what's important are very useful. I started the work in Uganda with a grant in an area called Kabale, which Katey probably knows and maybe nobody else here knows, but it's an area way out in western Uganda, very, very beautiful, and they have highland areas that have epidemics of malaria. And I'd been studying these epidemics in Kenya, and I wanted to do a hospital-based study, and I had gotten funding to do a hospital-based study in Kenya, but then that was in a site where I hadn't worked for a long time. I had established, I had put the grant in with some colleagues, and then they said, well, no, it's going to be difficult for us to do the study. So I was left with funding that I had and no site to do the study. And through a colleague of mine who had worked in Uganda, she said, well, there's highlands in Uganda, and you're going to meet with somebody who's coming to our university anyway to visit. This is when I was at Case Western. She said, why don't you talk to him? And so to make a long story short, we did that study in Highlands, Uganda, about looking at the correlations between antibodies to different malaria antigens and your risk of getting severe malaria. And that led to my not only working in Kabale, but getting to know the people at Malago Hospital and Makerere University, because it's sort of like the mothership, the main academic institution in Uganda. And so when another opportunity came along, I now had those connections. And so now all of our work is actually based, it's based in many areas in Uganda, but most of it's based in Kampala. And so I I couldn't have known that, but that small study was an itis for some much larger studies, which have then gone on to further studies as well. So it's entirely okay to go out, as long as you have an interesting question, it's of interest to the population there, and your colleagues there think it's important. It's great to start off with a very small study. That's fine and good. And I encourage it. One flip side of that I'll say is that this is, again, an opinion piece here, but I think it's great to start small. If you end up with a whole lot of small grants, you end up trying to do a lot of work with a little money, and that gets very, very difficult in a very short period of time. Plus, you usually don't have the capacity to support your colleagues overseas because you're on these micro budgets, usually underpaying people, et cetera. So I like to try to start small, but after a few small grants, move to larger grants that can support a bigger project well and can give back more to the people that you're working with. It's okay to go out on a limb. So I mentioned I've worked in Kenya for 18 years, and my work there is on the immunology and epidemiology of malaria. So I was approached by a colleague who is a neuropsychology researcher, and he said, I would like to do some studies on whether cerebral malaria is associated with cognitive impairment. And we didn't have a hospital site in Kenya, but I knew the hospital site in Uganda, having worked with my colleagues in Malago, and so that was a possibility. And I thought about it for a while, and then I thought, no, I'm really looking at immunology and epidemiology, and I'm sort of early in my career, I need to stay focused on this area. And plus, I'm not really so sure about this whole cognitive impairment thing. Like, if we just get rid of malaria, there won't be malaria to cause cognitive impairment. So I'm not really sure this is an important thing. So I said no. And my colleague, again, to make a long story short, my colleague was persistent. And he convinced me that, at that time, we still saw more than 1 million deaths from malaria a year and about 300 million cases of malaria a year. So he's like, well, malaria's not gone yet. And so there's all these kids coming into the hospital that you see at Malago Hospital, tens of thousands of them coming in with severe malaria. Don't you think you ought to study what happens to their brains? It had never been studied prospectively. So he convinced me that this was an important question, and I talked to my colleagues at Malago Hospital, and they were very interested. And so I asked colleagues of mine about whether I should do this, senior colleagues. At that time, I was an assistant professor and just sort of, I had a K award and was looking to an R and stuff. And they, to a person, said, no. Don't do it. Focus on what you're doing now. And I struggled with this for a while, and to be honest with you, I really put it in only because my colleague who came to me with this original idea and was at a small liberal arts university where he couldn't put in grants himself, kind of pleaded with me to do this. He really felt very strongly about this. And so more on the basis of that than on like good sense or knowledge of whatever, we put in the grant, and it got grant proposal, and it got funded. And so that was really sort of going into a different area, and yet that's probably the area that our research group is known for better now than our malaria and epidemiology research, what I still think is important, still do, but it just so happened that this was really unprobed field, and so it led to several other studies. And so I think it's good to take colleagues' advice, and you should not be unfocused, but sometimes if something really sort of speaks to you, it's okay to go out on something that, people think is kind of, not so much of a sure thing, because maybe that's why you need to look into the questions, because no one's looking at it. And so related to that point, thinking beyond your and collaborating, all of my studies are collaborative studies. We have real experts in severe malaria and malaria epidemiology in Uganda. We have colleagues here that have expertise in micronutrient deficiency, in hematology and endothelial cell biology, and more recently in sickle cell disease. And I've taken advantage of these people who know so much more about these aspects than I do to say, I know about malaria, I know about severe malaria, and I know about infectious disease and immunology. So we can do these things, and here are our questions. Where do you think your part fits in here? I'm thinking this, but I'm not in that area. And they've come up with great ideas, and we've been able to do so much more because we have this collaborative team where we're all putting in our specific part. our Ugandan colleagues love it because I provide one thing, they provide one thing, but these colleagues provide yet another thing, and a lot of times that thing is something where there's not as much experience in Uganda. So it's growth for everyone. We have Ph.D. students working on some of these projects, and so I believe that collaboration is just absolutely key to good research, and it's much more fun for me as a researcher because I am always learning new stuff. So pay attention to RFAs. This was really well gone over in the first talk. So I also cannot emphasize enough how much you have to both pay attention to the details of the RFA. You can get some real nasty surprises if you don't look at simple details like what is the budget limit or things like that. So, and that's happened to all of us. You hear the knowing laughter. So it's really helpful to have somebody else, maybe even somebody who's on the field, just read through and go, wait a minute, especially if you have a grants admin person, because they will point up these salient things to you, like, well, but this one says you have to have this person X. Do you have that person? It's like, oh, no, we don't. So, but beyond that, just paying attention to the fact that they're out there. So getting, like the NIH has listservs where you can get an announcement of the RFAs and program announcements that come from the NIH every week, and I highly advise that because new things come up. The more you do this, the more you'll find that colleagues send that your way, but it's just nice to know about it up front. So they can be really useful because that study in Uganda was done through an RFA, and I think for brain disorders in the developing world, and I think that had we submitted it as it was an R21, and I think if we had submitted it as a regular R21 study, we probably might not have gotten it funded because it was kind of on a limb. Last couple of points. As much as you should look at RFAs, I really do believe that you shouldn't chase funding, you should chase goals. And so things are constantly brought to me as, here's an RFA, don't you want to go for this? But it doesn't really align with our expertise or our mission. And unless there's a convincing reason why we should go in this new direction, and sometimes there is, I usually say no, even though it's an RFA and there's money there, because I think you have to have a vision for what you want to do. And if you get too diluted or too off focus, or you may end up getting these grant proposals if you're a good scientist, but you'll find you're in a whole bunch of different places and you don't really know what you're doing. And my perspective is, at the end of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, I would like to say, we worked in this area, we discovered this, and this is how it's made a difference. And it's hard to do that if you're just kind of all over the place, even though you can be very successful publication-wise and, grants-wise. And that's the end of my talk. So I'll take questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Philosophical and practical. I like it. Next is Katey Pelican, Doctor of Veterinary Medicine in Ecosystem Health Initiative and the University co-lead for USAID Respond project, and she's going to talk about partnership-based funding, government service funding, etc.
And the staffing emphasis was on previous experience with managing big projects. So, and then the technical approach, if you look at the RFA for these calls, it's pretty well laid out what they want. They have a long background of the political background and why this is important. For example, in One Health Workforce, they reference the Global Health Security Agenda. This is a White House initiative that actually it's a global initiative, but the USA is taking a lead. It's a priority of the Obama administration. So you kind of have to know what you're proposing fits in to Obama's agenda on global health security agenda. And then under each objective, they list illustrative activities. Pay attention to the illustrative activities. The illustrative activities are actually pretty much the funder saying, here's what we want. They're not really illustrative. pretty much with the technical, if you just repeat those with slightly different language, you're likely to get those 40 points for technical. And then heavy emphasis on visual and figures. They are not particularly interested in reading dense literature searches. In fact, we didn't have a single reference in our proposal. They don't really care if you know the literature on your project. What they want to see is that you've thought through how it's going to work, who's going to run it, they can yell at, literally, and then you have some good ideas. That's good enough. So that's sort of USAID. The other sort of funding that I've found, and it's sort of more recently, has been in some ways coming out of all the partnerships I've built with the Respond project. So we've been working in 10 countries with universities, so building university programs now in Africa and Asia. And in some ways, out of those relationships I've built, or we as an institution have built, and some of the work that we've been doing with capacity building, we're seeing increasing interest on the part of our U.S. government agencies in those relationships. And again, the Global Health Security Agenda, this is what was in our RFA. This is something that every U.S. government agency has to sort of have a plan for. So the White House is basically driving, asking government agencies to put together a plan for how to address the global health security agenda. So all these agencies are kind of scrambling a bit with how they're going to do that. What does that look like? And what they'd like to do is you have a trusted partner that they can help implement who have the relationships they need to do this. So that's actually brought in some interest in us, just based on those relationships we've built, that we can be that bridge trusted partner between the U.S. government agency and these international partners that we're working with every day. So my trip to Indonesia was funded through the USDA Foreign Ag Service, and we're building, I've worked with them over time, so we've become a trusted partner here in the US, where we've developed a tool for looking at One Health in the United States, and for helping to implement their national global health security agenda. And so suddenly they're like, oh, here's a trusted partner, here's a tool that we're implementing in the US, that could be cool. Well, why don't we try, we'll fund it to pilot in Indonesia. And those kinds of proposals often come up at the end of the year, under their fiscal year, right? So this happened in June. There's money that wasn't spent somewhere that they needed to spend that was actually funded through the Biosecurity Engagement Program, which is listed here, which is, again, a White House funding source. To minimize biosecurity risk around the globe. So USDA had BEP money that they couldn't spend for one reason or another, and they wanted to spend before the end of the year. So in June, they kind of called us up and said, hey, we have this money. We think this toolkit is cool. Can we think about where this could go? We want to spend it in Indonesia. What can we put together? And so over the course of like 2 days, we put together a 2-page proposal, heavily in collaboration with USDA. So we were basically listening to them and saying, well, what do you need? How could this work? What do you think? Who are the partners you would like to engage? We have these partners. And so, we ended up putting this, in a very short time frame, a proposal together, and, and getting a decent amount of money, $200,000. But again, it was built on this ongoing relationship that we have, trust, and then some interesting partnerships that they thought would be beneficial to them achieving their political agenda. So that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Thank you. Or do you have questions for one another? Yes.
Well, I'm from the Duluth campus, and you talked about having grant coordinators. We don't have too many of those on our campus. Are the services from the Twin Cities campus, any of them available to the coordinate campuses as well, the out-of-state campuses?
Do you have? Do you have like a central administration to which you give your grants, or do you give
a SPA office? Yes.
I would start with them.
They're pretty busy.
Yeah. We do have, departments and units here that don't have the most robust infrastructure, and the people I think that are probably the most helpful are the people who will have to deal with the post-award once the money comes in. So like the accountant or the department administrator would know a lot of those policies. And then I would say in terms of writing, do you have like a writing center maybe?
We do.
Yeah, so those
beginning.
Those people might be helpful in terms of the grantsmanship aspects or getting outside readers. yeah, that's a challenge.
In terms of the question, though, are any of the services on the Twin Cities campus available to the coordinate campuses?
The services here are, we have a kind of problem that's pretty typical for a university like this, which is we have this central spa, and I would say also that our spa officers are pretty busy, and I call them with policy questions that I don't understand, and half the time they can't pick up the phone because they're busy vetting these grants. So it's not so much that those people offer services, but they're resources where they might be able to say, oh, this person would know, or here's a website, here's a link, here's where the policy resides. I think that in universities like ours, every unit has its own way of doing things, and you kind of just have to be resourceful. And, I try to help as many people as I can, but I'm employed by CLA. Ellen is employed by the College of Education and Human Development, and Phyllis is at the Institute for Advanced Studies. So we're all sort of, sitting with our own little constituents, and I don't even know what services are available centrally to everybody, but I would start with the Office for Research Advancement and say, hey, what can we do? And actually, I think that, all of you can drive this. The field, which has now become known as research development, is relatively new. I think, 20 years ago, a lot of this infrastructure didn't exist at all, except for the SPA people who approved the grants. So I think recently, as federal funding has dried up and everybody is competing for the same grants, I actually had planned on starting our presentation with something else, but I thought I'd be way too pessimistic because I had looked up this NSF program that had been around last year, which was actually specifically geared to giving a small amount of money to researchers who wanted to spend a small amount of time abroad developing partners internationally for future collaboration. And when I looked up the RFP for this, it said this has been temporarily removed because there were too many applications and not enough money. So, because we're operating in this kind of environment, I think people like Phyllis and myself can be more and more helpful and useful to make researchers at a university like this more competitive. So the more you guys go to the administration and say, we really want research development professionals to help us, the more they will listen and give you services.
Any other thoughts on that topic?
Is the list that you showed up, that click, is that by division or by college?
Yes,
right. So it's still pretty much organized by college in terms of that kind of support.
Yeah, and so, if you look at some of them, it lists what their actual function is, and some of them are employed by individual departments, some of them are employed by collegiate units, and some of them are employed by the entire, school. So they're all very different types of positions.
Right, but I've always worked with our college people too. That's to say, the big Respond and One Health Workforce are both very, very large, so Respond original ceiling was $175 million and One Health Workforce $50 million. So we have had actually, Pamela Webb and the leadership at our sponsor projects actually get involved in that, but just because it's pretty large. So, and puts the university at risk if if they don't, they don't do a good job in terms of negotiating terms and things like that. But in terms of sort of putting the proposal together and in terms of sort of day-to-day management, it's at the college level. Yeah, it's really just this. It's actually post negotiation that they're more involved in.
Yeah, and we're just a small division, and so we do get requests all the time for people that want to work in Uganda and Kenya, and we can help with that because we do have those partners. But that's where we can help.
I would just add the one way that the IAS helps folks from Duluth and coordinate campuses is if you're a fellow or part of a research collaborative, I can help with, because we're a university-wide center, that's part of the services that we provide. So I saw another hand. Yes.
So I have a question for Chandy, and the point that you made about building institutional support. And I'm wondering what counsel you would give to a faculty member who went to his or her department head and said, this is what I'm doing. And they said, yeah, I don't know that I can really support that. What would you tell them about how to go about building other kinds of support?
One thing now is that global health, when I started doing it, wasn't kind of the buzzword it is now, so you're much more likely to get people interested now than in the past. Honestly, practically, I would say is like, if you're really interested in global health, go to an institution that values it. Like, you have to do that or it's going to be a problem. I mean, when Case Western, like, that was one of the major things they did in the med school. That's why I went there for fellowship and started as faculty. And when I came here, the person that hired me wanted me to do global health. So, I mean, but okay, let's say that's not the case. Somebody develops an interest and then the department chair says, I think the thing is you have to make the case for the value. Separate topic, we developed a global health track for our residency here in pediatrics. There was none when I and my colleagues came. And within 2 years, it was the number 2 reason why people came to residency here. I could make a very strong case for continued support for that to my department chair. So talking about grants, it's like if you can go to that person and say, here's what other people have done, here's how they develop things, this is what's happening in global health, all our residents, our medical students, our graduate students are interested in it, we could build this program. I mean, I think you'd have to really give a realistic thing of, if you start with this is the trajectory that it could go on, and this is the data I have to support that. And then, your department chair may or may not be supportive, but of course you can always do that first project without that support. I think it's when you're moving on, like, so you do the first project, you get results from it, hopefully publications, I think a really important part of this is getting other faculty members involved so that the department chair can see that it's not just your little pet thing. And then maybe with that, they'll say, okay, we've seen that you've started small and you've done this thing and it's grown, and now we're willing to put stuff into it.
So a hand over here, yes.
Hi. So I'm a student of international development at the Humphrey School, and this is a general question. You focused on language and being careful about details, but I also heard all of you speak a little bit about the relationships and how that influences the grants you get and the opportunities you're aware of. So I'm curious that when people are starting out, or for small organizations, what sort of advice do you have in terms of relationship building? Because of course you can be very careful and write well and things like that, but it always happens that organizations go with the people they know or the projects they're aware of. So what do you recommend in that case?
Are you talking about relationships? I'm not sure what organizations you're talking about. Are you talking about relationships with people in the international settings?
Yes.
Or relationships with like a new potential employer or a potential
funder. So
potential funder.
Unknown to them.
Yeah, okay.
And how do you?
So you're taking like the partnership-based work. I've actually built, these are U.S. government agencies. So I've actually built that relationship of trust with them by working here first. And I do the work internationally. And so that has made me that bridge, right? So, but I think that requires a service orientation. This is not necessarily collaboration on research, but I have been working with them here basically as in service work for the U.S. government. So, I've gotten small amounts of funding, but I've mostly built that relationship, and we've gone together to get funding. That's I would say that's my personal story. If you're working internationally, I highly recommend that you go talk to the embassy. If you're if you're a U.S. citizen and you want to make a career in the U.S., because the U.S. government is one of the major funders internationally, and like the U.S. embassy, the USAID mission in the country you're interested in working with, do the politics and do the ground. Get your feet on the ground and go talk to all the people, all the sort of stakeholders that might be funding work. If you don't want to do U.S. government, there are many other funders out there that are, you talk to USAID and NORAD, and, there's a lot of work that's being done in these countries. So if you know kind of where you want to work and what you want to work in, hit the pavement and go talk to all those people that are working there and find out, what their priorities, get the politics behind what they're doing and see how you fit in.
So I'll just add a piece about connecting with foundations or other kinds of funders for grants. if most foundations have a list of staff and program officers, and so you can contact a program officer, and I highly recommend that you do that fairly early on. You can chime into it as well, but if you come up with sort of your elevator speech of a project that you'd like to do, or a specific question that you'd like to ask, or even a technical question about the RFP, something that you can articulate well when you get a program officer on the phone, it's very helpful, or make email contact or something. But it's very helpful, and usually they're extremely helpful in talking through ideas or giving you insights or kind of their interpretation of things that don't show up in that very dense RFP. So I've had pretty good success with connecting with those people and getting some useful office information.
I would add to that, I think a lot of people are very reluctant to do that because they're afraid of, not putting their best foot forward or turning somebody off. For the most part, when we're talking about grant agencies, especially federal agencies, program officers do not have any say in the decision. So do not be afraid of calling a federal program officer, because what they will do is they will be involved in choosing the peer review committee, but they have absolutely nothing to do with the decision. So you can ask them the dumbest question and it won't matter. With foundation officers, it's a little different. It really depends on the foundation, especially if it's like a small family foundation. You may very well be talking to somebody who has a big stake in who gets funded and who doesn't. Also with foundations, not all of them are as receptive. Some of them are really good about it and give very good feedback, and others actually specifically will say, no calls, please. So, do a little research, find out if they want to be approached. The relationships that I was talking about in my presentation really had more to do with your pre-existing relationships that you build just through your own research, and this is sort of a matter of long-term career networking. So, the people that I've been involved with in these large international grants, they had already spent, maybe 2 months doing field work a couple of years ago somewhere, and so they would go to an NGO and maybe have a workshop or something of that matter, where when they go to write a larger grant, they can go back to that relationship and they can have that as part of their grant to write in a collaboration with somebody. They could say, we are going to be partnering with this person from this organization, just because they may have spent maybe a couple of days with them, but that's somebody that at this point, when it comes time to write the project, you can say, who do I know there that can give me a little bit of an in? And it maybe doesn't even necessarily have to be there. Like for the USAID project in Medellin, they didn't really have very strong relationships there, but one of the people, the PI in the project, had a very strong relationship with a Mexican university, where she could say, as part of the little paragraph about her, that she had done this kind of thing at another institution and demonstrate all those relationships that she built up there. So that's the kind of thing that I was really talking about.
I would also say, I spoke about DAI, government contract companies. If you know what you want to do, again, you need to understand what you want in your career and what you want to do. But if you know part of what you want to do is more development kind of work, those contract companies, they have a lot of USAID money, and they're often looking for sort of contract expertise. So if you know you have an interest in development work and you know kind of what you want to do, it might not be a bad idea to go sort of sell yourself to some of those companies. They have their challenges. But you are a development practice student, so I assume that you have an interest in international development work. So it's, in some ways, it can be challenging to work with organizations, but, many of them, I think, are doing really good work, and you learn the development world, and that's valuable, especially if you want. I learned a lot about the development world, and that's very valuable for me in terms of understanding why things are happening and where they're happening and who's doing it.
Did you want to add anything?
Like Katey and I come from very different perspectives. So she's working with groups, whereas mine have pretty much everything I've ever submitted has been, there's a mechanism and you submit. There's, so there's nobody to contact, you don't talk to anyone. So it's really different things. And so you have to know like which one appeals to you and which one you're good at. And they can be highly complementary. Like, because of Katey's work in Uganda and Kenya, we have these great students. Now, I applied for a Fogarty Fellowship, and so some of those students, Ugandan and Kenyan as well as U.S., are working in those countries, but they wouldn't be able to work there if Respond hadn't set up the infrastructure for them to work in. So the types of work we do can be extraordinarily complementary, and you just have to know what you're good at. I don't think I could do what Katey does at all. I just, you have to know your skill set and, know what you can do and what you can't do.
And also, what do you want to do with your life, right? I mean, if you want to be a, biomedical researcher, do not go talk to DAI, go talk to Chandy. But if you want to do development work, then that might be an option.
So we'll take one more question, and then you can talk to us after the session. Yes.
This was just a comment. I really appreciate what all of you have said and just the importance of a piece that you don't even see is advancing knowledge is the knowledge of partnership. So I wanted to just say that this month, November, we're in partnership with the School of Nursing, the Minnesota U of M libraries, and Center for Partnership Studies. We're releasing or opening or launching a peer-reviewed open access online journal for the science of partnership. And we're looking for articles from people, from scholars who won't be talking about their biomedical results, but what are the results and the insights and the knowledge that you have related to collaboration and partnerships. So this is open access, it's global. Our editorial board is from around the world, and we're seeking to advance the knowledge of partnerships. So it's starting, we're launching our first issue November 15th, and I urge those of you that do such beautiful work in collaboration and partnership to think about getting your knowledge in that area out.
So who do we contact?
You could contact me.
And your name?
Teddy Potter from the School of Nursing.
Okay, great. Well, on that note, thanks to all of the panelists, and thank you all for being here.